Evans Library. My name is Krista McLeod. I'm the library director. And I do want to welcome you here for this lecture on the history of Methuen native Major Robert Rogers. Rogers is a controversial figure in the history of the pre-revolutionary period in America and in the 7 Years' War, which is also, of course, I think better known as the French and Indian War in this region. So this program is part of the Essex County Trails and Sales events, which are happening all around our region this week. 2 more Trails and Sales events will be taking place in Methuen. Later this week, on Sunday, there will be 2 cemetery tours. The first one is at Meeting House Hill at 10 a.m., 10 to 12, and then the second cemetery tour this Sunday will be at the Grove the Grove Cemetery, and that's from 1 to 3, and that one specifically features Civil War veterans' graves. That's happening this weekend, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention, if you go to those wonderful tours, take a little extra time in between and come to the library book sale, which is happening this weekend, and we'll be here from 9 to 5 on Saturday and 12 to 4 on Sunday, and all day on Monday. So if you're doing cemetery tours, you might want to stop in at the library as well to buy some books. So our speaker this evening is Tom Spitalere. Tom is a local historian and founding member, I believe, of the Essex County Ghost Project. Tom is also affiliated with many other organizations, including the Haverhill Historical Society and the Buttonwoods Museum. He's very active in a lot of local history organizations. So thanks for coming this evening, Tom. And without further ado, let's talk about Robert Rogers.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Yes, I'll just do a quick thing before we get started on Rogers. Someone had asked a question earlier. My background, I went to Methuen High School and basically fell in love with Methuen history thanks to a guy by the name of Mike Hughes, who got me on the commission when I was 18 years old with Ernie Mack, who was also another mentor of mine, who's now passed on about 4 or 5 years now. And I fell in love with Methuen history and the local history ever since I was a little kid, hearing the stories about Methuen and Lawrence and beyond, when my grandfather would be telling stories and everything. So I stuck to it, went to Bradford College, not too far from here, right over the river, or down the river, or up the river, wherever you want to go. And I majored in early pre-colonial New England history, so basically the Viking settlements in New England to the end of the Civil War, which, when you really think about it, especially the early wars, which we're not going to get into fully tonight, but if the library wants me back, I'll do a special talk that includes all of the wars that took place during what is called the French Indian War, better known as, which is King Philip, King William, and King George's, and all of them. Because it's a very interesting time period. And this area of history, including what we're going to talk about tonight, according to Nathaniel Saltonstall, who the Saltonstall seat was in Haverhill, not in Salem, folks. I know we go to Salem this time of year and we hear about Saltonstall. He was actually born and raised in Haverhill. At the site of the Buttonwoods Museum was the Saltonstall seat before they left town. And then the new house was built, which is the Duncan House. But Nathaniel Saltonstall called this the bloodiest war in American history. And it really was. The French Indian War, when 1754 to 1763, we were British at the time. So the British owned the land along the Atlantic Ocean, were becoming very populated. So they're basically the original 13 colonies were becoming very populated, and they needed more space. French, on the other hand, well, they were also over here, but they owned the land along the St. Lawrence River Valley, which included the Great Lakes and the Ohio River Valley. That's a big area too. But the problem started because they had too many people here. And everybody wanted land. And that's what started a lot of the problems. Population growth of the French territory worried the Brits, set up Crown Point at Lake Champlain, and also Wabash on the Mississippi and the Missouri rivers. Those were forts. And so in 1750, the British met in Paris, and the dispute progress, there was no progress made. They were still arguing between each other, the British and the French. And at the same time, what else was going on is the British and French are fighting, but they're also bringing in the local tribes. So the British had their friends, and the French had their friends. And nobody could get along. So 1752, Marquis Dufresne became Governor General of New France and ordered the removal of the British from the Ohio River Valley. That must have made the British really happy. Well, it was going on, more British volunteers were coming and settlers were coming into this area, and the French were pushing them out, and they built the fort on Lake Erie, Fort Prequel Island, and the thing started. Then in 1754 was the Battle of Great Meadows that laid southeast of Fort Duquesne. This was the first engagement of the undeclared French-Indian War. And Washington beat back the French on that first attack. 1755, the French were in full control of the Ohio River Valley, but they lost control elsewhere. Great Britain won battles at Lake George and set up forts at Crown Point, Fort St. Francis. Crown Point was built more forts in the valley, and Lake Champlain, and then Fort Henry, Fort William and Henry, which were all located south of Lake George. So basically, if you look at this map, they were building all up in here in forts, all this area. They could take to secure the control. By 1756, the French-Indian War had been declared. British troops grabbed the upper hand, captured Louisbourg, Nova Scotia, and Fort Frontenac. There have been many battles through the years at Louisbourg, which we get to in another talk. In 1759, Jeffrey Amherst took control of the British forces from General Abercrombie. With the help of Major Robert Rogers, which we'll be discussing, they took Fort Ticonderoga and later Crown Point. In 1759, Quebec fell. September 18, 1759, also at the same time, St. Francis fell, and the British destruction under Major Rogers, And then in 1760, Montreal fell. General Amherst took over Fort, and then Major Rogers took over Fort Detroit. And around February 10, 1763, the Treaty of Paris was signed, giving Britain full control of North America. So that's the war we're going to be, this is where Rogers fits into this. So you see there's a lot of stuff going on. And back in that time period, if you lived in New England, or New York, or Vermont, doesn't matter, wherever you are in New England, you could walk out in the morning and go, oh, it's a great day today, and if you thought the American Revolution or the American Civil War was a civil war, these wars were fought in backyards. Towns were burnt to the grounds all throughout the early history of living out here. It was not easy living. Methuen did not exist early on. This was actually Haverhill. So all the early Haverhill history, all the 1709 massacre, all that stuff is actually Haverhill. And there was some stuff that actually happened in modern day Methuen that's listed in the Haverhill history, which we'll talk about another night. All right, so Robert Rogers was born November 7, 1731 in Methuen, Massachusetts. 4 sons of James and Mary Rogers. That's the location he was born in. There is no house there. It's at the corner of Hampshire and Cross Street. They just built a bunch of new homes within the last, say, 5 years. So that's where Ernie Mac figured it out to be. It was up on the hill further back, not right on the road. There used to be a sign here, I remember as a kid, but it disappeared. Never was put back. But there may be some hope coming for that. And like I said, he was born November 7th, 1731, correct? I read the Londonderry town history books because I read old history books, and I don't mean those nice, beautiful postcard ones. They're great, but I like the town history books. This is his baptismal and birth records. I got copies of them. They're up on these boards you can look at afterwards. First Church congregation here in Methuen. All right, then he moved on. He was baptized November 14, 1731 at First Church. Birthplace again, it was 49 acres of land, and the house is probably located on the western slope of the hill, which now is a development. Be nice to get something up there, but I'm actually working on something we'll discuss at the end real quick. But that's where this was, right in this area here. I took this picture many years ago. That's no longer looks like that. I didn't want to go take a picture of somebody's house to change the picture. They might not be too happy, so we just leave well enough alone. So around the age of 12, the family moved up to Dunbarton, New Hampshire. And you can see a cellar hole on Rogers Road near the cemetery where his brother's buried. Now, don't go up to Dunbarton looking for this monument. Because if you think it's going to be a monument, Joe and Caitlin went up there with me one day. We drove up to Dunbarton to go looking. We drove by it 5 times. I think there's a picture in Joe's book of it. It's a 1938 marker. You can see the cellar hole, but in the middle of summer you can't see anything because they don't even take care of the marker. It's this high out of the ground. How many times did we have to walk by it, Joe, and drive by it? Half a dozen times, 5 times? Yeah, I mean, not an easy place to find. But it's there, which is good. There's a lot of markers up in New Hampshire with his name attached to it, actually. Where his brother's buried. So, 1744-48 is King George's War. Roger sees action in King George's War at the age of 15. Conquered New Hampshire's attack and served as a private in Captain Daniel Ladd's scouting camp in July 16th to October 2nd, 1746. Guarded the frontier of New Hampshire. From August to September 12, 1747, he was in Ebenezer Eastman's scouting crew, guarding the same areas. In 1745, Rogers Farm was destroyed by St. Francis natives, and only the apple tree survived. Now, as I get deeper into Rogers, there is a lot of controversy, but anytime you deal with French Indian War, early American history, you're going to find controversy. Besides being involved in a local historian, I'm also the vice president of the Dustin Garrison House, and I'm on the Family Association Board of Directors as an honorary historian to the Family Association of the Hannah Dustin family. So controversy during this time is, with the way things change throughout the years, is very common. But let's think of what's going on in Roger's life as we go through this, and then at the end, maybe we can understand what happened. So his farm's destroyed in an attack. Roger's father was killed by his best friend in a hunting accident. Know who his best friend was? Who? Who?
No, never mind.
No. Who's heard of Live Free or Die? The motto. John Stark was very tight. John Stark actually was in Rogers Rangers. But Stark mistakenly, because his father was dressed, it was a heavy, cold winter day, so what did you do back then? You didn't have coats, right? Bearskin. He was mistaken for a bear. It was an accident. Happened a lot. He built his home and barn in Dunbarton, New Hampshire, and he was trapping and traveling all the way up to Canada. So picture the area he's walking in every day. He started scouting in 1753, under Captain Jeffrey Goff. That name ring a bell to anybody? Goffstown, New Hampshire was named after him. In 1754, from August 23rd to September 21st, Rogers serves as a private in Blanchard's detachment of the New Hampshire Regiment posted up on the Connecticut River, which is pretty much on this Vermont map would be down here. So he's up on the Connecticut River Valley, which is shown here, over here too, and you can see it in these maps here later on. So by now that becomes important because he's done a lot of work in the Connecticut River Valley. So as a frontiersman, he's been all over the great woods of New Hampshire, Vermont, and all the way up to the Canadian border. So January 1755, he raises 24 men from Nova Scotia in service of in a Shirley, Mass regiment. So he does that. Here's another. Okay, then February 12th, he cleans himself up by breaking his contract with Massachusetts because Mass didn't want to pay him. Mass didn't even really want him. So he moved his regiment up to New Hampshire into service. In April of 1755, he was commissioned captain of the 1st Camp of Blanchard's New Hampshire Regiment, designated Ranger Camp Company. Rogers Rangers is born. So it's April 1755, Rogers Rangers is born. He continued in 1755. He had the first Battle of Bloody Pond. I'm still working on, that is the one that made Rogers real famous, and I'm trying to work through it because there's not a lot of historical documents on it, so we're not going to really discuss it tonight. You can find Bloody Pond if you Google it, but there's a lot of stuff in there as a trained historian that I got question marks. So if I got question marks, I'll wait till they're all answered before we talk about that battle. But basically, it was a battle in a pond. They surprised the Native Americans, and when you start shooting in water, that's why it got called the title of Bloody Pond. But as far as anything else with that, I'm not going to get into it because I don't have all the facts yet, and I still haven't found a lot on this.
Where is that?
That was in right on the Connecticut River Valley area. Because I've read 2 stories of the Battle of Bloody Pond. One's in Vermont, one's in Connecticut. So I'm trying to still figure out where before I put my name to it on anything like this at all. 1755, June, helps build Fort Wentworth and at the forks of the Connecticut and the upper Aroostook rivers in Coas County, New Hampshire. By August 20th, 1755, Rogers and his camp are detached from the New Hampshire Regiment to join Johnson at Lake George and add to his scouting army. 1755 to 61, fought 27 battles and caused the French many problems. He continued to hone his skills between battles, training his men in the ways of the Native Americans. As a kid, the Native Americans taught him how to fight their way, which was basically hide behind trees, shrubs, stones, whatever you can find, in the water, surprise attack, where the British, on the other hand, would line up 1,500 men, and they'd march straight at you, they'd shoot, the other people would shoot back, and whoever had the more men won the field. This would come into play by 1776, what Rogers did during the French-Indian War. In 1756, he commanded to form an independent camp of Rangers. These men were the most fearless, aggressive group he could ever had. They were hunters, trappers, thieves, etc. Rogers was never going to be a British regular. As a young guy, he was creative, we'll say. He created his own money and went to jail for it. But that's another important step in Rogers' life, why later on it becomes controversial. The Queen got him out of jail so he could form his Ranger Corps to fight during the French-Indian War. Keep that in the mind as we go on and move forward. And his men were all the same type of men. They were hardy men from the seacoast of Portsmouth, backwoodsmen, hunters, trappers. They weren't gentlemen. They were far from gentlemen. Most of them had records. Most of them served in the Queen's jails. But when you're fighting a frontier battle, that's what you need. Marching troops 1,200 strong at something isn't going to work too well. All right. So, as an independent camp, the men were under British military jurisdiction or the Code of Conduct. He created his own, which they still use today. Okay, which I'm going to read a few of these, if I can today. Don't forget nothing. Don't ever take a chance you don't have to. Keep your gunpowder dry. Don't sit down without posting somebody around you so no one could sneak up on you. And you can read the rest of these. I actually left the glasses in the car. But these orders are still used today. That's what his men lived by. And they had to be hardy men. All right. In August 3rd, 1757, it was called the St. Patrick's Day Battle, the massacre at Fort William and Henry. Rogers was ambushed and his men suffered major losses. Rogers was injured and temporarily relinquished command of his Rangers and led his men to safety and held off the attackers and escaped into the night back towards Fort William and Henry. So, he did lose a few. In 1758, Britain placed Robert Rogers in charge of all the Ranger Corps in North America. In March 1758 is the Battle of Snowshoes, Rogers Rock, northern tip of Lake George. You can see some of that in these flyers right here. That was a very interesting, so you got some stuff here on it too you can come up and look at. So, heavy snow was falling, bitter cold, heavy casualties on both sides. Rogers pulled his men back up the hill and waited till dark. Pitch black, no moon, cold, snowy night. He ordered his men to put their snowshoes on backwards. The very next backwards and walk out. So they stuck around the war party down below. The natives thought they had him surrounded. That next morning, they took the hill thinking they were finally going to get rid of Robert Rogers. Because to the Native Americans, Rogers was called the White Devil. He was hated by them. When they took the hill, guess what? Rogers was gone. They looked down the hill, and there's Rogers' men scampering away safely. That's when he got the title of White Devil. The next morning, they escaped. July 1758, a failed attack on Fort Ticonderoga. And then in July 1759, a year later, the French Indian allies finally take Ticonderoga. And September 13th, 1759 was the first conquest of Quebec. But let's get into this Rogers a little bit deeper. By 1759, the Rangers had themselves a great reputation for fighting and pulling off improbable victory after improbable victory, with a few losses along the way. By September 13th, 1759, very important date. "200 men left for Crown Point under the direction of Major Robert Rogers, including a local kid from this area, John McCurdy, who was born in Havel, but I don't know where he passed away or anything, but his family's all from this area, so I figured it was important to throw it in there. The mission was simple. Go up to St. Francis, the home of the Abenakis, also called Odenak, located on the St. Lawrence River in New France. So he had a simple job. March his men past this point, all the way up here from Portsmouth. Pretty easy job. How did he do it? Want to know what this is? Canoe. He carried this canoes over the mountains. They made human rope chains to cross the rivers. So he and his 200 men strong left Crown Point and went up the Lake Champlain to Missisquoi Bay. Everything went according to plan until the 5th day. A keg of gunpowder exploded. Now when a keg of gunpowder explodes, you're going to hear that for a while away. Especially back then, there was all woods. Exploded, wounding Captain Williams. He sent Captain Williams back to Crown Point because an injured man would not work. And some men. Reduced to 140 men, he forged on. By September 20th, he arrived at Missisquoi Bay without any detention. He left a few trusted natives to hide and watch the boats and supplies, and alert him if the French discovered the supplies. A few days later, the natives caught up with Rogers and gave him the bad news. The French found the supplies. Rogers sent Lieutenant Levy McMillan with 10 men to Crown Point so he could have food and supplies sent to Charlestown, Fort Number 4, which is not in the same location it was back then. There is a Fort Number 4 museum, but it was actually down the street, closer to the childhood home of guy made fireworks go off in what, 75, guys? 1975 was it? Carlton Pudge Fisk's home, right down the street from Carlton Fisk, because he was from up there. So that's Fort Number 4 down here. Great place to go visit. All these forts are a lot of history. Few days later, okay, so yep, Fort Number 4. By the 10th day, the Rangers were only 15 miles south of St. Francis. They forged the St. Francis River by making a human chain. And we're talking Whitewater River here. We're not talking Merrimack on a dry summer day like we've had this year. By 8 p.m. on September 23rd, 1759, Major Rogers, Lieutenant Levy Turner, and Sign Avery snuck into the village of St. Francis, and saw the natives partying and having a good time. At 4:30 a.m., the Rangers surrounded St. Francis and attacked the village, killing everyone in sight, according to historical documents. Sight that was a native or some descendant of a native, a French soldier, whatever was in there. Rogers' report indicates 200 Abenakis were killed. Rogers' group, Captain Ogden was wounded, 6 privates wounded, 1 Indian scout passed away, and the raid was over by 7 a.m. So from 4:30 to 7 a.m., they went in and did all that damage. They freed all the hostages, and they started for home. 8 days after they started together, they were out of food. Food was running low. Some of the Rangers took loot instead of food. He ordered his men to take all the food. They decided to take French gold, the religious chalices, which you've probably read in New Hampshire folklore stories, hidden stuff up in the White Mountains that they've never found or anything like that. There's some stories in that book about that from Fritz Weatherby's New Hampshire. So that you can read that at the end if you'd like. But they didn't take any food, so they started starving. And remember, this is September. The animals are starting to go away now. The woods aren't as plentiful because we're getting cold at night. So up north, there's not a lot of plentiful nuts to eat or anything like that. So he kept moving his men. They forced through the hardship. And he lost a lot of his men on the way to Fort Number 4. On the 9th day, he broke his men up into smaller groups. This happened on the north side of Lake Menipog, which is still up in Canada. So they still had a long way to go to get even to Fort Number 4. 2 days later, inside Avery's group was overtaken by natives, 7 captured, 2 escaped. Another party by Lieutenant Levy Dunbar and Lieutenant Levy Turner were ambushed, most killed, including Dunbar. Turner was captured. Rogers' group, on the other hand, continued their course, but it was a tough one. There was no game to hunt, not a lot of food on the way, very cold temperatures, and his men, under his strong leadership, kept his men moving through day and night, through swamps and the woods. His Ranger Corps skirted the eastern shore of Lake Menipog, passing through what is described as a chestnut land along the way, crossing several rivers. He continued in a southerly direction, hugging the eastern side of Lake Wallaby, beneath Mount Pascua, now located in the western branch of the Pacific River, continued down the river to the junction of the Connecticut River, 10 miles or so north of the rendezvous point, which, here's a little extra history on this. North of the rendezvous point, guess what that's called today? Haverhill, New Hampshire. Yes, there is a Haverhill, New Hampshire. There's 6 sections of Haverhill, New Hampshire, up in the northern Connecticut River Valley, way up there. So they made it that far. Afraid that the natives might capture them, they moved out westerly along a longer route, and it would be harder to detect them because the natives used that waterway that abuts that in that area. Also, the modern day area of Route 5. Who's been on Route 5 before? So that's the way Rogers brought his group down, by Route 5. This area was known as a high ambush area. Rogers and his men were about 15 miles west of Pacifics, and he continued to march his men to Wells River. He continued to follow Wells River then swung the southeast along the north side of the Wichita Mountain. From there, they traced the Wells River to its junction with the Ammonoosuc and the Connecticut near modern-day Woodsville, New Hampshire, where supplies were supposed to be on October 20th, 1759. Woodsville, New Hampshire is one of the 6 sections of Haverhill, New Hampshire. I've spent a lot of time up there learning their history. Lieutenant Samuel Stevens, hearing guns, left Rogers and his men with no food or supplies. They heard gunshots, so they left Fort Number 4. So there goes all the food for the Rangers. So what they did was, they got together. It could have been deadly and cost Robert Rogers and the rest of his men, his Rangers, their lives. He built a raft, put Ogden on the raft, who was injured severely, and went down the Connecticut River on a wooden raft. Probably something similar to what you would see in this picture, a very simple logged raft down the Connecticut River. Not an easy thing to maneuver when that river's running. If they fell in the water, they could have drowned. They continued down the river to the Quechee Falls. Slowly using a rope, they got the makeshift raft over Quechee Falls and floated down the river. They saw some men cutting trees along the Connecticut River. They helped Rogers reach Fort Number 4 by October 31st, and as he promised, he came back on the 10th day for his men, and by November 7th, 1759, everyone was back at Fort Number 4 with plenty of food. So that's where we go with that. Now, so that was Rogers. From the time his men left St. Francis on September 13th till they reached Fort Number 4, November 7, 1759, Rogers lost 3 lieutenants, 46 sergeants, and privates. A few returned later because they were prisoners, but most had died. Very sad story. So what happened after St. Francis with him? So from 1755 to 61, Rogers takes detachments of his battalion of Rangers into 27 recorded battles and scouts during the French-Indian War and all the way to the heart of French Canada. In 1761, February 14th, he arrives in New York from Detroit expedition when Amherst rewards him with the captaincy of Paul Demere's South Carolina Independent Company of Regular Rangers, commissioned, dated October 25th, 1760. In 1761, June 30th, he marries Elizabeth Brown. Now, Rogers was a backwoodsman, certainly not a British regular. He marries Elizabeth Brown. No relation? You would have loved this one. Elizabeth Brown is the daughter of Reverend Arthur Brown of Portsmouth, New Hampshire. So a backwoodsman with a very colorful language, and he also had a very good healthy habit, which we'll get to in a minute. Married a minister's daughter. They were so proud of him. All of you familiar with the old white church in Portsmouth? Downtown, the historic one? I haven't seen it yet, but there's supposedly a stained glass of Robert Rogers and Rogers Rangers in that church. That's also in one of Fritz Weatherby's storybooks that I have. So I just haven't had time to go out there and actually go looking to take a picture of it. 1765, while seeking favor in high London circles, Rogers enhances his fame. His coach is held up by a highway. So he was traveling through England and got robbed. While reaching into the window to demand the ranger's wallet, Rogers pulls him into the coach with one arm and collects his reward. 1765, October 12th, Rogers presents a memorial to the King's Council urging search for the Northwest Passage, hence the famous book. Okay, October 1765, he writes the Journals, A Concise History of North America, published by John Milan in London. Joe, that's not the book, is it? It is. We actually have, Joe Bella owns a copy of the book. You could look at it right here. In 1765, December, Roger completes his play, Pontiac. December 18, Roger sails for America in a frigate, and on 1766, he arrives back in New York. Gage reluctantly hands him a commission and instructions for the Michelmack Village area of on June 10th. By July 23rd, he promptly in Johnson's huge native conference in Oswego, while his way to the Northwestern tribes. He was brought in to negotiate with the Northwestern tribes and try to work with them. But from there on, he still lived a pretty colorful life. After St. Francis, Rogers went through the ups and downs, and he gathered, he got himself in trouble with British officials and trouble with, he had a little problem. This is nice, in the wintertime, you need to stay warm, right?
Alcohol.
He loved his rum and hot water. I've tried that once. What a taste. And that was only a sip. That was more than enough for me. But I figured if I give talks on Rogers, I better try it, right? So he loved his rum and hot water, and didn't sit well with Washington, who was the leader of the American Revolution, put in charge of all the troops. Not even Washington wanted him. And then in England, he worked as a spy for England for a while because he had nowhere to go. He died in 1795. Now, here's the problem. Years ago, there's a great document owned by the city of Methuen about some work that was done regarding Major Robert Rogers in England. They hired a historian. They say he's buried in a pauper's grave in England. I have read reports where his brother had the grave removed back to Vermont, where the brother owned land. I've also found a stone in Greenland, New Hampshire. Is it Greenland? No, Greenfield, the one right up over here. In the plot of where the minister's family's buried. All the stone says is M. Rogers. I don't know if that's Robert. I don't know who that is. But it's in the family plot. And I cannot find any certificates or anything going through. But the stone clearly reads M. Rogers. Now, does that stand for Major Rogers? Has no death dates on it or anything. So we don't know where he's buried. We can assume somewhere maybe in England. Even though Rogers faded out of glory by the end of his life, his legacy lives on. The destruction of St. Francis turns the tide in the French Indian War. Because right after St. Francis went down, Abercrombie took down the Plains of Abraham. Even though General Abercrombie died, that was pretty much the end of the war. Then came the Treaty of Paris. So the destruction of St. Francis turned the tide in British favor, and we at the time, over the war, and his standing orders, which are still used today in the modern day Rangers. So remember that, even though he turned his back later on in the Rev War, they still use the standing orders today in there. Okay, and the way he fought his battles, okay, is another one of his legacy left behind. Remember I said earlier, they fought by lining up 400 men, 500 men, they shoot at each other. Make ready, aim, fire, then the other group would load muskets. Now, they still use those type of Ranger tactics today. Now, if it wasn't for Rogers Rangers, and yes, he did turn on Nathan Hale, and yes, he did have Nathan Hale hung. That is all historically accurate. But April 19th, remember the Battle of Lexington and Concord? How did they push back the British? Hiding behind trees and stone walls, they pushed back, as one journal I read, a bunch of lobster backs all the way back to Boston. That was in one of the journals I read as part of the Lexington militia group that was there. So his guerrilla warfare still lives on today. So we have his orders, the guerrilla warfare, and so when you hear someone talk about great war heroes, please let them know that not all warriors are fully explained in history or history classes or in schools across America. Just remember what Rogers did. Yes, he did turn, and yes, he did have Nathan Hale killed. But the same token, Washington didn't want him. And by the way, today our military, our great military, and I have family in the military, when you retire, you get a pension. Do you think Rogers got a pension? No. So he needed to work to pay bills. Plus he had that hot water habit. And so he went to work for whoever paid him, basically. And I've seen the show Washington Spies. Have you seen that?
Turn.
Yeah.
There's Scotch accent.
Yes. Yeah, he's in that show that was on AMC. Turn?
Yeah, Turn.
Thank you. Some of that stuff, I'm not sure how historically accurate it is. And I don't think he ever had that big... I've never seen pictures of him with a big belly and big beard. He was always properly shaved and trimmed because he was a military guy. So, if you want to come up and look at this stuff, you're more than welcome to. I found this. This is what a Ranger uniform would look like. Believe it or not, I found this after a yard sale on the side of a road. Never know what you would find. And all these books talk about Rogers, and I have plenty more. Any questions?
Did he have a family with Elizabeth Brown?
He had one son, and his name was, what was it, Joe? Do you remember? Was it Robert too, or John?
I think
John. And I don't know much about him. I never followed down the line. But he didn't have, like you would think back then, a lot of big families. And I'm going to just leave you with one thing, then we'll get to your question, ma'am. Who have seen the American History Channel French Indian War? Have you seen that one? It's a great one. You probably could, the library might even have a copy of it for. At the end, the last scene in the show is got a French Indian War soldier holding a musket going, we got rid of one world power, we can get rid of the next. So the French Indian War was a very important, vital war to the birth of the United States. And that's when if we could get rid of France, the farmers according to Lord Cornwallis down south, farmers with pitchforks, those farmers with pitchforks had the guts to go, we don't need to be under your feet anymore. Let's become our own country, which led to the American Revolution. Yes?
So are not the current Army Rangers named for Robert
Correct.
Rogers, and when did they form them? World War II or before?
No, the first current Rangers were formed in the 1700s.
So that's just a continuation?
Continuation,
of this?
correct.
But they're like, I don't know, the Army's military, like the Navy SEALs, they do all the most difficult
Well,
stuff.
this was not an easy work getting up to Crown Point. There were no roads. They
But
carried,
they scaled the cliffs on Normandy.
correct, that was also very dangerous.
When they had a battle or a raid,
Yes,
they normally kill everybody in sight.
they did. There was very few, unless they went into a village like Deerfield where they've captured a few people. There were some captives up there. There's a great story about this girl named Abigail, and I forgot her last name. After she got freed, she almost got killed by the Rangers. She took a knife and tried to stab Rogers in the back for what he did up at St. Francis. Because the women felt more comfortable with the Native American men at that time than they did the colonials, because Native American men treated women differently, a lot nicer. So that's another story taken out of this.
So there was Herrick's Rangers also in Maine, like in 1750s, 56.
There were ranger companies all over.
Okay. And they were still chartered by Massachusetts?
Correct.
So in 1758, you said he was, he left the, whatever, he was
Let's go
put
back
in
in.
charge by the Brits.
Yeah. A lot of things happened in 1758, yes.
And so he had these, he went with some rangers up to Ticonderoga, but also he had organized 4 companies of rangers that went to Nova Scotia.
Correct.
For Cape Breton. And are all the rangers' enlistment rolls from that year in the England?
I have not, now, what got me started on this wasn't just Mr. Mike Hughes. I always collected my Methuen history stuff. This is all, you can look through this at the end, no problem, take as much time as you want. But what got me started on this, again, was we always pay tribute on Memorial Day to our soldiers. 4th of July, Memorial Day, we go put flags. Make sure my father gets a flag. He was a Korean War veteran. We put them out for the Reservoir soldiers, right? How about the French Indian War soldiers? That's when I started getting more into this and started reading town histories. I started looking for French Indian War soldiers to make sure they have flags on those days too. And I do have some of the Methuen enlistment names here, and other enlistments in different towns that I've pulled out of town history books. Yes, sir.
Well, the flags for the French and Indian War soldiers, would they be British flags?
They should be British flags,
But they're not, they're
but
American flags.
they've been given American flags, yeah. But at least they're being recognized. The thing is, there is only one town that I have seen that recognizes the French Indian War. And I need to ask Caitlin, where was your brother's wedding at? What town?
Mansfield.
Mansfield. If you go to center of Mansfield, you'll see, like, we have our Civil War, our Rev War monument. They actually have a war monument for the Revolutionary War soldiers listed. Now, a lot of those soldiers that fought in the French Indian War fought in the Rev War, but some didn't. So I've always tried to find these graves in these old New England graveyards. Yes, Bev?
Having worked on the meeting house in Methuen, the cemetery, there are 7 Indian War soldiers there, and then 2 of them carried into the Rev. And you can find journals and listings for the French Indian War rosters down at Massachusetts Archives,
Okay.
if you're interested.
Yes. You first, sir. No, you first.
I'm Bob Donahue from First Church.
Okay, hi, Bob.
For information, we still have the pewter bowl that was used to baptize Robert Rogers. And we still use it as during the baptism that was conducted yesterday. If anyone would like to see it, you can come on any Sunday around 9:30 before worship. You can stay for worship if you want, or around 11:15 after worship, and we'll show you where it is.
I've actually been in there and seen them, because you guys do something that I don't usually miss, because I went to chapel there. That was my preschool.
Okay,
There's a big dinner you guys have.
yep.
I like going to that dinner. So I'll always go in the chapel and go look at the Rogers stuff, so yes. And you were next, sorry
I
about
just wanted
that.
to mention, I mean, you talk about the Revolutionary War also. The second in command and the Lexington Minuteman was a member of Rogers Rangers. I can't remember his name off the top of my head. I remember that.
Yes. And I forgot which one that was, but yeah, you're right. There were a lot of people. In fact, Swamp Fox, they did the movie
Princess Mary.
Francis Marion. He was a ranger.
He was down south.
He was down south, but he was part of that South Carolina regiment group, ranger group that was trained as a ranger. So a lot of those rangers were Rev War soldiers, but some of them were not. And those are the people that need to have their names on a stone, which I haven't forgotten. Years ago, I came up with an idea to put a monument up, and I'm still working on the logistics of that in Methuen, with Roger's name on it, and the list of his men that were Methuen people. So at least they'll be recognized. And I have those lists. I know Bev's probably got a list. Her and I will get together and figure out everything else. So, any other questions? Yes, Bev?
I have a question. His family went to Dunbarton. What was in Dunbarton? Because.
That's a great question.
The reason I asked this is Thomas Dow's family went to Dunbarton.
I know.
You know, like, what was the draw there? Was there gold in the water or what? You know what I mean? Like,
There's nothing.
it seems like there was nothing.
There was a lot of people from Havel that went to Dunbarton too. I don't know what made Dunbarton so,
What made it so popular?
the only thing I could think of, when you look at the settlement lists,
Uh-huh.
Concord was already settled.
Yeah.
Concord to Dunbarton wasn't that far. So if you had to work in Concord and you didn't want to pay, you wanted a working farm community, not so much Concord, because Concord was expounding really heavy up there, Dunbarton would be the next place to have your farms. Because that's quite an interesting community.
You might be mistaken, but it was well settled because it was a former Indian village. So much of the land was already cleared. So if you were a young man looking for new farmland,
You would have had it, yeah.
woods or cleared land, you
Yeah.
pick the cleared land.
Right.
Gotcha.
Also too, John Stark went up to Dunbarton.
Yeah.
And he met his beautiful bride up there, Molly Stark. By the way, they were cousins. And by the way, Molly, and I can't remember her last name off the top of my head. I should have wrote it down just because I figured this might come up. Molly's family was actually from Haverhill, which would have been Methuen at the time, and related to Hannah Dustin.
Was she an Emerson?
No, she was, I think a Peasley, but I'm not, I'll double check and get back to you on that one, but they were all related anyhow.
Yeah, they.
Any other questions? The other thing that makes this easy, I just want to say this, I'm big into genealogy and I've helped a lot of people. Some of these genealogies have some great stories written in them about this time period. They just don't have names. Sometimes they'll have a small little 3 or 4 sentence about a battle that the family actually wrote on. So genealogies have been a great place. Town history books. You can come up and look at all of this. Town history books, another great place. So maps and everything else. So if you want to come up and look, you're more than welcome to. I'm just going to put these 2 things back real quick so I don't lose them. And then we'll put everything back at the end.
Well, thank you, Tom.
No problem.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.